Happy Monday, and welcome to chapter 16. We will begin chapter 16 with a little get to know you, get to know me, more like, because this is my family tree. Are you ready? This is just the paternal side of my family tree, and it is incomplete. It just has, it doesn't have the last generation, except for my kids, which are here. But okay, bear with me, I promise. There's a method to my madness here. My great-grandfather was named Howard Quirt, and was a newspaper guy. He ended up being the editor-in-chief of the Marshfield, Wisconsin newspaper. I think it's called the Gazette, maybe. Married a beautiful woman named Lila, and had 3 beautiful daughters, including my Aunt Margie, my Aunt Barb, and my grandma, whose name was Audley. My Aunt Margie married an insurance salesman named Bob and had 2 daughters, my cousin Barb, who is a Unitarian minister in, I think, Princeton, New Jersey, maybe. My cousin Ellen, who's a clown. Was a clown. And she, I think it was like a clinic for like burned down executives, like to help them like enjoy life again. I don't know. Anyway, she's amazing. She does weird and wonderful things. Cousin, okay. My Aunt Barb had, cousin Barb married an astrophysicist named Rob. 2 children. I didn't get that one's name right, which is embarrassing, but I don't remember his name. Okay, Aunt Barb married the best fisherman I've ever seen in my life, coincidentally named Rod, my Uncle Rod, and had 2 kids, my cousin Steve, my cousin Chris. Steve, 3 kids, Brian, Andy, Chance, Chris, 2 kids, Amy and Anna. All right, my branch here. Grandma Audley married an Italian guy, off the boat Italian. His name was Donato Achille Santercole. But he wanted a good job. He wanted to be a banker. You couldn't have a name that sounded like that and get hired as a banker. So his name became Donald. Right? It was Donato Achille Santercole. It became Donald A. Sandro. So Don and Audley, my grandparents, had 2 kids. My Uncle Phil, my dad, and of course my dad married my mom, had me, and I married my wife and had Isaac and Nora. Why am I talking about this? So here's the deal. See if this makes sense. My dad and my uncle look a bit like each other. Like you can tell that they are brothers, right? If you look at them. And they also have some resemblance to my cousin Ellen, but if you look at the 3 of them, you would know that these 2 are more related than either of them is to my cousin Ellen. Does that make sense? You see why? And if you measured their DNA would be more alike than either of theirs is alike to hers. Does that make sense? Someone tell me why that is. Why is their DNA more alike than theirs is with her?
Dad, right?
Who's dad?
Well, both dad. Because, well, your dad has the Italian dad, right?
Okay. Is it just okay?
Even though the 2 aunts came from the grandma, they both have different dads, even though they live together. They probably got the similarity from the one final great grandma genes being the 2, your grandma and the great aunt, but they have different dads. So
So different parents is really what you're saying it comes down to. Well, let's try. What are you gonna say?
Oh, is it having to do with their gender, like the X, Y?
No, this isn't one of those. Okay, so if you look at Brian and Anna, you can tell Brian and Anna are related. You can look at them and see some resemblance, even though they have different parents. And if you look at both of them and then you look at me, you can tell that they are more related to each other than either of them is to me. Does that make sense? Why? Why is that? Can someone put it into words?
Grandma.
Oh, her, right? So, like, you're saying they are more alike. And if you measure their DNA, it'll bear that out. Because they've got her in common. And that common ancestor they have is more recent than the common ancestor both of them have with me. Does that make sense? So, like, with me, they got to go back how far? There, yeah? Yeah. So, like, common ancestor for them here, common ancestor for them and me here means they're more alike than either of them is with me. Can we make a general rule about people that says the more recently two humans have had a common ancestor, the more alike they are genetically? You think that's going to be true pretty much every time? Cool. Welcome to chapter 16, which is Darwin's theory of evolution. You just learned what's basically his first of two big ideas, which is called descent with modification.
We can learn about Pangea.
You already learned about Pangea, didn't you?
Yeah.
Good. We don't have to do that. Are you going to do your own family tree? No. Is that something you really want to do?
No.
It's like you can. So first, defining evolution, which we have already done when we talked about the 8 characteristics of life. Evolution is simply change in a population over time. Any population you pick on Earth, even the ones that reproduce asexually. We know that asexual reproduction is basically cloning, but there's still changes that happen. How do the changes happen even when you're not doing sexual reproduction?
Environmental.
No? How does a bacterium that basically clones itself every time it reproduces, how do differences crop up in bacteria?
I can't remember.
What's that called?
Mutation.
Mutations, right. So all living populations do it. That's what evolution is. Evolution is a thing that happens in populations. What we talk about in chapters like this is how does that change happen? What drives it? And this is one of those underlying things that, and you don't have to write this down, but that's a pretty famous quote from a pretty famous guy. It really ties everything together in bio. It makes everything else kind of make sense. You've learned the secret code of life, right? The secret decoder wheel. That secret decoder wheel plus this is really what underlies everything else you learn about. Okay, so that change that we're talking about, you can see it in multiple ways. You can see it in fossils, obviously, which are basically snapshots of species that lived millions of years ago. Most fossils you find are of organisms, species that don't exist anymore, that are extinct. So right there, you're seeing evidence of change. And not only that, we kind of used to be sort of stuck with fossils, but we've been paying attention to evolution for long enough now, a couple hundred years, that we've seen it. We've seen it in action. We've seen populations change genetically over time. especially easy to see in short-lived critters, critters that don't have a very long lifespan, so they reproduce fast. Bacteria, birds, insects, stuff like that. But even larger animals, you can see that evidence of evolution in there, especially now that we can measure DNA. I mean, it's easy. Important to note that we're not just regurgitating the stuff Darwin said. He said he had, like I said, he had two really big ideas that have held up, but a lot of the details he got wrong. So it's a theory, we've talked about what theories are, that has been added to, modified, subtracted from, and really kind of evolved itself over time. So that's the background. Back to my family and the rule we made that the more recently two humans have had a common ancestor, the more alike they're going to be genetically when you measure their DNA. You're all good with that, right? Yeah, so that's a big idea. If you just change the word humans to species, that's Darwin's first big idea, which is a big idea that we call descent with modification. And again, just copied and pasted what I said about my family and changed the word humans to species. We all work on the same genetic code, so there's no reason that other organisms would work differently than, my family. It's all A's, T's, G's, and C's, codons, anticodons, amino acids. And that seems like, to some of you, I can tell, it seems like kind of a no-brainer. Like, yeah, duh. But it's more powerful than you would think. Because what it means is we can, if we can measure genetic similarity, like, okay, how alike are they genetically, which we can do now that we know the code and how to measure it. And assuming that evolution happens at a fairly constant rate, that organisms, species are becoming more and more different from each other the longer it's been. Because that's what that is, right? Like, I said it one way, but you can very easily make it the other way. In other words, I can very easily just say, yeah, okay, the more recently they had a common ancestor, the more alike they are. But I can also say that as soon as you split, as soon as you have your common ancestor and you're on different branches, those branches start getting differenter and differenter. More and more different? Yeah? So if that's the case, again, we can just measure that similarity and figure out how long ago that common ancestor was. We can start to build a tree, not just of my family, but like of the whole thing. And so that's what Darwin started doing. Again, lots of mistakes. He didn't have access to DNA testing and analysis. But he was smart enough to realize that, again, if that applies to humans, if it applies to finches, which were one of his favorite subjects, then you can basically start to draw a tree of life and show common ancestry, common descent, the idea that we're all kind of related. And that's it. That's his first big idea. You already know his second. The second is the one you learned whenever you learned evolution before. But less talked about, but probably more important, is the first one. That as soon as splits happen in the evolutionary tree, the critters on each side of the split start getting more and more different in a measurable way. And so you can track it back, and we're better at it now than we ever have been. I mean, if it worked for humans, obviously it's going to work for bears. Right? Look at this. I love this because I love bears. I know. Isn't that weird? Raccoon?
Why is that panda less?
I know. It's probably got a complex. It's a lesser panda. Am I really a panda? It looks more like a raccoon. Now, look, let's do the same thing. Look at the brown bear and the American black bear. If you saw them, first of all, run, because a brown bear will totally kill you. Not a black bear, but a brown bear. You know they're related. It's like my dad and my uncle, right? You know that they're going to be pretty genetically alike. They're obviously bears. And if you look at them and compare them to the giant panda, you're like, no, these are brothers. This is maybe a cousin, right? Maybe, like a weird cousin, the clown maybe. Uh-huh. And if you measure their DNA, same thing. And you can measure their DNA precisely enough that we can do this. We can make it into history, right? This is basically a million years ago. And we can say, all right, they had their common ancestor here. They had their common ancestor with the panda here. That puts these guys' common ancestor at somewhere around, I don't know, 7 million years ago, whereas with the panda, it's like 21 million years since they had their common ancestor. And you start to develop this evolutionary historical tree of life. So the more recently, again, two species have had a common ancestor, the more alike they are genetically. Does that make sense to everybody? Because that's it. That's the first big idea. If you get that, you got half of what you need to know basically for this chapter. Not really, there's details, but that's the spine of it. Okay, we'll talk about how you make it into basically a molecular clock, how you use that information, but understanding it's enough for a Monday. Good? I'm not going to give you anything new today. You do have the guided reading that is due tomorrow, 16.